Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And for the last few days, we've been talking about the super ancient Hebrew version of Esther, the original version. And we've been talking about the later Greek additions to Esther and how those Greek additions kind of make sense. I mean, I see why people did it, given the pressures of that moment in time. But it muddies the water a little bit in terms of what you're reading when you pick up a random Bible, because some of them will have those additions to Esther that are an expression of that later Greek tradition, and others will be the one that we're looking at, which is the historic original version rooted in the Hebrew. So the Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Septuagint, happens. It's out there. It's in circulation. It gets quoted and cited and assumed a whole bunch in the New Testament. And as we get past the time of Jesus and out of the first century into the second century, and as the canon is really taking shape amongst Christians of what is the Old Testament and what is the New Testament, Esther ends up getting debated more than a whole lot of other books of the Bible because of this later tradition and these later additions, and not everybody being quite sure what to do with them. Well, then you get into the 400s. There's this guy named Jerome, and he does this amazing translation project, one of the most important works of writing and translation ever in the history of ever. And it's called the Latin Vulgate. He takes the source material of the Hebrew and the Greek and he translates it all into Latin. And obviously the Western Catholic Church associated with Rome leans very heavily on this translation for a very long time. Again, Jerome is considered a saint. Well, Jerome understood that these Greek additions were just that, Greek additions. So he translated the Hebrew portions, the early stuff of Esther, the stuff we're looking at, into Latin, and that was the whole thing. Then after that, he positioned the Greek additions at the end, also translated into Latin, with a series of notes saying, hey, this is what these are, this is a different thing, this comes after the fact. And that's more or less how it sat for about 1,000 years until the time of the Protestant Reformation. Well, one of the points of contention in the Protestant Reformation was over a series of debated books called by Protestants the Apocrypha, called by Catholics and Orthodox the Deuterocanon. The Protestants viewed themselves as going more with the tradition of St. Jerome, saying these books are useful and instructive, but should be positioned differently from the rest of the historic canon. The Catholics at the Council of Trent in the middle of the 1500s said, no, we're canonizing all of this deuterocanonical or apocryphal stuff, including the additions, the later Greek additions to the book of Esther. Now, this is not to say that the Catholics believed that these were not later additions. No, they knew that, and they still know that. And when I open one of my Catholic Bibles today, here's the note that happens right on the front end. This is from, what version is this? This is the NRSV Illustrated Catholic Bible from Catholic Bible Press. This is the note that they have on the front end of the book of Esther. Note: the deuterocanonical portions of the book of Esther are translated from the Greek version, the Septuagint, and comprise 107 additional verses that have been inserted at the appropriate places in the translation of the Hebrew form of the book. The disordered chapter numbers come from the displacement of the additions to the end of the Hebrew form of the book of Esther by St. Jerome in his Latin Vulgate translation, and from the subsequent division of the Bible into chapters by Stephen Langton, who numbered the additions consecutively as though they formed a direct continuation of the Hebrew text. Okay, I got to hit pause on this note here for just a second. First, as you can see, and as I've been saying through this whole conversation, this is not a point of fight between Catholics, Orthodox, and Protestants. Everybody agrees that these are later additions. There's just disagreement with what you do with them. Protestants would say, oh, these are useful for understanding Judaism in the second century. Catholics and Orthodox would say, we understand these are later and that they are a little bit different in tenor and tone from the original material, but we still think they belong in here. And we've had to be creative with the way we number these chapters just to put it back together in a cohesive order. Picking up with this note on the book of Esther, the deuterocanonical portions are given in the order found in the Greek text so that they may be read in their proper context, but the chapter and verse numbers conform to those of the King James or Authorized Version. Proper names are given according to their Hebrew rather than their Greek form. So acknowledging that if you pick up a Catholic Bible, the chapter numbers they're very disorienting, here's how it breaks down. In the Hebrew version of Esther, we start with the whole business about Xerxes, and he ruled over all these different places, and he's having a great big banquet. But in the Greek editions version, it opens with a dream of Mordecai. In the second year of the reign of Ahasuerus the Great, on the first day of Nisan, Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shemael, son of Kish, of the tribe of Benjamin, had a dream. He was a Jew living in the city of Susa, a great man serving in the court of the king. He was one of the captives whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had brought from Jerusalem with King Jeconiah of Judah, and this was his dream. Now, you and I have been into the deep water historically together on this book, and I'm sure you caught what was off there. There's clearly a mistake that was made by the people who crafted the Greek editions to Esther. They got confused by the original Hebrew language regarding Mordecai and who he was a descendant of. You remember that the English translation makes it just a little bit ambiguous as to whether it was Mordecai who was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, or whether Mordecai is descended directly from someone who was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And you can see that the authors who made these editions got confused on that point, so they would have us to believe that Mordecai got taken captive in 586 BC, and that then he's young enough to be active and accomplishing things in the court of Esther in the reign of Xerxes in the 470s BC. So in this case, if he got taken in 586 and he was 0 years old, he would be, 110, 111 when all of this stuff is going down. It just doesn't add up quite right, but it's a totally understandable mistake. Still, that's how the additions to the book of Esther opens. Then the next thing that happens in chapter 12 is a slightly different telling of Mordecai exposing the plot to kill the king. Then we get Esther chapter 1 as we know it, Esther chapter 2 where she becomes queen. Then we jump back again to Mordecai discovering the plot. So we get that a second time. The big difference between the two plot accounts is that in the Greek editions, Mordecai gets given a job in the king's court because of what he did, and he becomes rivals with Haman while in that court. Chapter 3, Haman gets mad that Mordecai won't bow to him, decides that he wants to get rid of the Jews. Then we jump to another Greek edition in chapter 13, where the king writes a letter and we get like the full text of the letter saying that the Jews are to be killed. Then we get a little bit of extra stuff from chapter 3. Then we get chapter 4, which we just worked through, that has Esther and Mordecai going back and forth about what involvement she will have in all of this. Then we get another Greek edition labeled chapter 13, where we get a prayer of Mordecai to the Lord, and God's name is all over this. And I mean, really, it's a beautiful prayer. It's well written, and it makes a connection between, an overt connection that I've made several times between the deliverance that's shaping up to happen here in Persia and the deliverance that shaped up and happened with the Passover events back in Egypt. Well, the Greek edition labeled chapter 13 really spells that out in Mordecai's beautiful prayer. Then you get another Greek edition. This is labeled chapter 14, and now this is Esther's prayer. And in this, she comes off as incredibly upright and faithful to God in a very 2nd century BC Alexandrian Jewish way. She prays from a position of great weakness, indicating that all this was thrust upon her. She doesn't want to be married to this Gentile. She abhors the crown upon her head. Really, this prayer alone in this much later Greek edition that is not a reflection of anything that Esther ever prayed, it frames her completely differently than what we see elsewhere. Then we start to get ahead of where we are in the story, so I probably won't go through all of the rest of these details. But we get another Greek edition labeled chapter 15. Then we go back to several chapters uninterrupted of the original material. Then we get a few more editions at the end, including the payoff on Mordecai's dream that happened right at the beginning, and this little postscript at the very end, which I will read as well. In the 4th year of the reign of Ptolemy and Cleopatra, Dositheus, who said that he was a priest and a Levite, along with his son Ptolemy, brought to Egypt the foregoing letter about Purim, that's the feast that was created out of the events of the book of Esther, which they said was authentic and had been translated by Lysimachus, son of Ptolemy, one of the residents of Jerusalem. Even in that postscript, you can sense the dubiousness of this source. And I suppose, all of that's okay as long as you just know what you're reading here. These additions to Esther, compared with the rest of the Bible, really are very exceptional, just in what they claim to be, the way they augment and transform an already existing book. It's a very unusual proposition compared with the rest of the Bible. Is there value in there? Oh, I mean, yeah, for understanding second century Judaism. I think the artistry of the prose in the prayer of Mordecai is pretty remarkable. And I think it's always good to encounter a character in the Bible who cares about uprightness. And in their own way, that's what these later reimaginings of Mordecai and Esther are trying to do. My goal in spelling all of this out over the last 4 episodes or whatever it's been is not to pick a fight with people who cherish this version that has these later additions tagged onto it. My point in covering it is that I just don't see how we cover the book of Esther in the style that we're covering it and with the thoroughness that we're trying to tackle it with, without acknowledging all of these things and the history behind it. And that's just not a quick conversation. I'll tell you what is a quick conversation. Me reminding you again that we're having a party on September 25th in Rapid City, South Dakota to celebrate 1,000 episodes of the podcast. And a whole bunch of you have signed up, and I'm excited to meet every last one of you. And I hope a whole bunch more of you sign up, and we'll just have a really fun party, and it'll be great. If you want to know more about that, you can click the link below in the show notes or just go to thetmbh.com/event. All right, picking it up with Esther chapter 5 next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.